I'd like to share some thoughts and memories of Boris. I'll start with the early days. When I arrived at MIT as a young assistant professor, I was assigned space, which was a room that previously had belonged to Boris. And in this room, there were low desks, and to my surprise, the benches were also low. Everything was low. And I thought, gee, that's weird. How do you do science in such a low environment? And it turned out that that room had been used primarily to streak bacteria on Petri plates, which people did from a sitting position. And Boris immediately revealed his kindness to me. He invited me to attend his lab meetings. I got to meet people in his lab, some of whom are in the audience today. This really provided me right away with a sense of community, and this helped, I think, my own lab grow, being a part of something bigger. And for that, I really thank Boris. Now, I remember we used to talk a lot about bacterial genetics and history of science. And one day in the hall, I don't know why, but an experiment called the Pajama Experiment came up. Okay, and that's Pajama, you all know that probably, but it stands for Pardee, Jacob, and Monod. And this was a very important experiment done in, I believe, 1958, in which bacteria were mated. So there was a male, which was an HFR, which contained the lac operon. Okay, and the lac operon would be transferred early to the female, and it was repressed, so there was no beta-galactosidase. The female had a deletion of the lac operon, so there was also no beta-galactosidase, and more importantly, there was no lac repressor in the female. So when you did the mating, under uninduced conditions, magically beta-galactosidase appeared because the operon found itself in a milieu with no repressor. And that would go on for a while, and eventually repressor would build up in that cell and would turn off the lac operon. So I said to Boris, I said, gee, yeah, I think that's a really, really cool experiment. I've always loved that experiment. And Boris said to me, his response was, yes, it's the first experiment that proved the existence of messenger RNA. And I just shook my head and said, come again? He said, yes, it proves the existence of messenger RNA. Now, a competing hypothesis to messenger RNA, the idea was around at the time. The competing hypothesis was that proteins were made by dedicated ribosomes, and so that the coding RNA would be the ribosomal RNA for that particular ribosome. And it was known that ribosomal RNA was extremely stable. Okay, so that's the backdrop. So I said, Boris, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you look at what happens in detail, you see that beta-galactosidase starts getting made, and the differential rate of synthesis increases for a few minutes, but then plateaus, and it keeps going up, but at the same rate. So the rate of increase stops rather early. And I said, yes, okay. And then this is way before a repressor comes along to turn it off. And I said, okay. And he said, that means it must be encoded by an RNA template, which is also unstable, because if it were encoded by ribosomal RNA, the differential rate of increase would continue for the half-life of ribosomal RNA, which was more like hours instead of minutes. And those conversations were pretty typical in those days. I miss them. So it was not an accident that when my lab and Boris's lab moved to this building, maybe 21 years ago or so, we were again adjacent to one another. So those are the early days. Let me say a word about Boris and MIT biology rigor. Okay. So back in those days, prelims exams for our grad students involved their receiving a list of abstracts, carefully chosen abstracts from papers, with no titles, no authors, just the abstracts. I believe there were 5. And if my memory serves me correctly, they got these something like an hour before the oral exam. And the exam involved them discussing 3 of them. Is that right? Did I get that right? Yes. All right. So on my first prelim, where I sat in the committee, the examining committee, the chair was Boris. And Boris actually began the questioning. And I realized right away that this was very serious business. Because Boris was extremely, so what would happen is you would start with something very specific to the abstract, but pretty soon the topic could wander here, there, or anywhere. And Boris was extremely thorough, and what I remember is, boy, he does not countenance sloppy thinking. So I adjusted my own style as an examiner to meet this high standard of the department, which is a standard set by Boris. Now, if I'm not mistaken, that same year, one student on a different committee I sat on was Chris Kaiser. And by the way, he did quite well. Let's get that out of the way. And I believe, I may be wrong, Chris, but I believe he still remembers a question that I posed to him that day about the lac operon.
I do.
You do? Can I tell you something? I don't. I've probably forgotten what that question was, maybe 30 years ago. Okay. Next topic, faculty lunches. So these occurred every day in the Building 56, 5th floor conference room. This is called a conference room, but it was minuscule by today's standards, okay? And Gene Brown was the department head at this time, and he would always be there first. And you could try your best to get there early, but you could never get there earlier than Gene. And most of us would arrive with brown bags, as the outside food vendors were much less prevalent then, except of course for the falafel truck. And the lunches provided a thrilling, if intimidating, setting for a young faculty member to divide the day. And what I can say about Boris is that I learned as much or more at those lunches about history and culture than about science. And he loved to hold court on topics ranging from Henry VIII to ancient history to opera, politics, literature, poetry, what have you. And I have clear memories of Boris and Gene playing off one another in describing the nuances of historical events. Usually there were events I had some recollection of, but now we were operating at a whole different level here. And the role those historical events had in shaping world history. And both of them were inspiring to me as lovers of history. Okay, the next topic, this is one I think will be unique at the symposium. It's Boris as matchmaker. I was fortunate enough to help organize a 75th birthday symposium and dinner for Boris, which was held at the Whitehead. Many of you attended this. Boris was very appreciative. A week or so later, he invited the organizers out for a dinner at a restaurant, as I recall, in Newton Upper Falls. And I noticed there was an attractive young woman at our table that I didn't recognize. And the next day I asked Boris, who was this person? And it turns out that she was somebody that Boris met on a plane, and he invited her so that I could meet her. Note that I was unmarried at the time. So my guess would be no one else is going to talk about that aspect of Boris. But to me, it ties in rather well with my other remarks, because it was simply another measure of his kindness. Years later, I did remarry, and remember when I brought my wife to the first departmental function after we were married, this is maybe 10 years ago, the first person to run up to us to greet us was Boris. And he seemed quite pleased that my wife's first name happens to be Borislava. So today many will talk about Boris's great research achievements, his training of students and postdocs, his key role as department head in building the biology department into a world-class powerhouse. That will be covered. I wanted to talk about more personal stories because I see Boris also through a lens of these memories. And it actually started when I took his undergraduate course. I think it was called Microbiology, or 721, in the early 1970s. And it was a stroke of good luck indeed that our association would develop into a relationship that would extend for many years to come. So in closing, I will say Boris was a close friend, colleague, and a role model to me. He was a Renaissance man, imbued with a heaping dose of kindness. And I still, to this day, proudly display a painting that he gave me on the wall of my office. And I truly miss him. Thank you.